Hi, my name is Adriana White, and I was diagnosed with autism in my 30s. As a kid, I never quite fit in, and I wrote a lot of stories about girls who discovered that they were really aliens or fairies. As a librarian, I've read a lot of stories and noticed that there are some in which the characters could be seen as being autistic. So today I'd like to share with you a couple of those stories. Legends tell of a phenomenon in which human babies are taken away and replaced with old fairies. From the United Kingdom to Germany and Scandinavia, stories are told of children who are suddenly one day not themselves. The following story is an adaptation from several Changeling stories that were gathered by Professor D.L. Ashleman of the University of Pittsburgh. And this is The Changeling. Mary and Jacob Miller were the only couple in their village who did not have a child. So the day their daughter was born was a momentous and joyous occasion. It was custom for mothers to spend the first 6 weeks by their infant's side, but Mary and Jacob could not spare that time. They needed to be out in the fields, gathering food and preparing for the long winter ahead. And so they packed up their little baby girl, took her to work with them. Once they got to the fields, Mary would set the baby down on a pile of hay and return to retrieve her after a day of work. And so it went for months, until one day Mary returned and felt like there was something different. Her baby, instead of cooing and laughing, was silent. And instead of meeting her parents' gaze with a warm smile, she looked away and seemed disinterested. She didn't really respond to them at all. And so Mary and Jacob were concerned and voiced their concerns to an older woman in their village named Clarissa. Clarissa used to live in the United Kingdom and knew right away that this was just like the stories she had heard of changelings. "Your baby," she told them, "has been taken away by fairies and replaced with an elder fairy. And they've taken your baby to raise as their own in the forest. If you want to get your child back, you need to take this creature that they've left with you and take it to the forest and leave it there. They won't let one of their own starve, so they'll bring your child back and make a trade. And," Clarissa added, "you could even speed things along by abusing and starving the child a bit." Now Mary could not see herself abusing and starving this poor creature, even if it was really an old fairy, but her husband Jacob wasn't so sure. He didn't know what to do. That night when Mary slept, he took the baby and walked to the forest. As if she could tell what he was planning, the baby cried and screamed the whole way there, and Jacob felt his patience wearing thin and his skin starting to crawl as he neared the forest. He set the baby down on the forest floor and waited and waited, until finally dawn was about to break and Jacob found himself having to make a choice. Would he leave the baby behind? Would he abuse and starve it as Clarissa had suggested? In the end, Jacob found that he could do neither. Packed the baby up and went home and told his wife Mary the whole thing. Over the years, their baby girl never quite caught up with the other kids in the village. She didn't talk much, never quite responded to her own name, and didn't really seem interested in other people, but she was always kind to people and especially to animals. She could always make people laugh, and she could make the most interesting little toys and dolls out of the most unlikely of materials. Jacob and Mary wondered from time to time if they had made the right choice, and looking at their daughter, who was different, but not in a bad way, the Millers told themselves that, yeah, this was their little girl, and they wouldn't trade her for anything in the world. The end. Children with disabilities were not well understood in previous centuries, and so these changeling stories were a sort of wish fulfillment fantasy for these families. And the real stories often did not have happy endings. Another place where we see stories with characters reminiscent of autism are stories about aliens. We've told stories of aliens for decades, if not longer, and we always imagine extraterrestrials lacking Earth context and culture would act completely different from the rest of us, in a way that resulted in characters with very autistic traits. One example of this can be seen in Robert Heinlein's 1961 novel Stranger in a Strange Land. The novel is too long to tell in its entirety, but there are some ideas within it that are worth sharing. And so this is Stranger in a Strange Land. The first manned mission to Mars ended in failure. The entire crew of the expedition was lost in a botched landing attempt. The people of Earth mourned, brainstormed, and tried again. The second manned mission to Mars arrived on the Red Planet 25 years later. So imagine their surprise when the Earthlings stepped off of that spaceship and found Michael Smith. Michael was 25 years old and had never known anything but Mars. He had been born on the planet to 2 survivors of the first expedition, and Mars was his home. The Earthlings wanted to bring Michael back to Earth right away. Michael was unsure about this, but the Martians who had raised him, those intelligent aliens who had lived on the planet for centuries, they encouraged him to go and share his story and share their stories. And so Michael went, a stranger in a strange land. On Earth, he was initially sequestered from the other Earthlings on the off chance that he brought back some kind of Martian disease with him, and also to buy time so the US government could figure out a way to explain this strange new Earthling. And it was noted that Michael had never seen a human woman before, so his staff at the Bethesda Naval Hospital was comprised entirely of males. One of the female nurses there, Jillian, thought that this was very silly and wanted to go see him. The male guards had spoken of Michael as being intelligent and very mature, so she was sure he could handle the sight of a woman. She snuck in one night and met Michael and found him to be a perfectly normal young man. Sitting in his quiet, small room, he seemed like any other Earthling. Jillian encouraged him to leave the hospital and see what Earth was really like. But once they left, Michael was overwhelmed. Mars had been peaceful and quiet, but Washington, D.C. was a mess. It was chaotic, it was loud, it was crazy. They took refuge at the home of a physician nearby that Jillian knew. The doctor looked Michael over, and they discovered that Michael was incredibly intelligent and intuitive, but also naive. He didn't care for human clothing. He didn't quite understand human concepts like jealousy and war, and he didn't quite get human jokes either. Over the next few weeks, Michael tried to understand Earth culture, but he always felt lost and lonely. Jillian encouraged him to tell his stories. So Michael shared stories of Mars and how the Martians would always preach for him to be peaceful and altruistic. He taught people the Martian language, and he made connections with those stories. There were those, unfortunately, who did not trust Michael, and ultimately one of them assassinated him. So, though Michael came to the planet Earth as a stranger, he left as a martyr. And during his time on the planet, he encouraged others to re-examine their lives and to be kinder. And in the end, the Earth was better for it. The end. People with autism often describe feeling as if they're aliens that have been dropped on Earth without an instruction manual. So it's easy to see why these stories resonate so much with autistic people. Both of these 2 stories feature characters who don't quite fit in, but who also at the same time make the world around them a better place. And so it is with people with autism as well. Autistic people make the world better, kinder, and a much more interesting place. I hope you enjoyed my stories, and I thank you so much for listening today. Thanks.